It's really a pleasure to welcome you to today's first session titled Connections and Connectivity in Psychological and Brain Sciences. And we're really happy to have, I think, two of our most distinguished faculty members, Linda Smith and Olaf Sporns, give these two talks. Linda, many of you know, of course, is internationally known for her studies in cognitive development. She emerged early as a leader in this field, receiving an early career award from the APA, and more recently has been awarded the prestigious David Rumelhart Prize in Cognitive Science, another Distinguished Scientific Career Award from the APA, as well as this Tracy Sonnenberg Award from IU. And you know, there are lots of different people we could ask to speak into this session, but we really wanted to choose Linda as one of our speakers because she's someone who I think exemplifies the investigator who collaborates widely and very successfully with many others in her field. And as many people will say, is if you speak to her about their collaborations, see, this wouldn't have gotten anywhere without Linda, is often the way they start. So Linda will give the first talk, and then Olaf will immediately follow with his talk. And Olaf, too, is internationally known for his work. In this case, is moving to theoretical and computational cognitive science. He, again, collaborates widely in some very high-profile projects if you've been watching any science news. He's also quite a prolific author and quite well known for both the papers he writes as well as a book that came out a couple of years ago called Networks in the Brain, which received some nice awards. He's also received the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2011. Olaf's research focuses on uncovering network principles that are important in organizing both anatomically and functionally the human brain, and he's intimately associated with the connectome, which many of you have heard of, and I believe he may have also coined that term. For Olaf, the idea of connections begins in the brain, and how in the study of those connections, how they spread outside the brain as well as to other investigators studying the brain. So it's kind of an interesting perspective that he'll bring to this talk. So for the details, as I mentioned, Linda will speak first, then Olaf, and then we'll have both of them come up to the stage here, and I'll moderate a discussion with the audience on the topics that they've brought up in their talk. So, Linda?
Okay, so my understanding was that we were supposed to talk about connections in our work and in science as a way to the panel that is the second session talking about the future. But if you know me, you know that I often don't see the world the way everybody else wants me to. So I'm not going to talk about connections. I'm going to talk about pathways. And I'm going to talk about pathways in development and as a segue into thinking about pathways in science and pathways and where the future of science is going. Now, pathways are sort of like connections, they're just dynamic. So if you take a developmental perspective on a problem, then your topic of study is pathways. It is the chains of events in time that lead to new structures and that lead to new functions. So you can study pathways at the molecular level. You can study pathways in embryology. For example, embryologists ask questions about the chains of events that lead to the neural tube. You can also study, which is what I do, pathways in behavioral development and the pathways that lead to new structures and new functions, such as being able to walk or knowing a language. So if you study pathways, if you study developmental process, you are immediately required to be integrative and synthetic, because what is creating a child who can walk or talk or have pretend play are a bunch of changes at multiple levels of analysis and over multiple time scales. So you have to think about, in terms of what is building those new structures and functions, change from milliseconds to minutes to hours to days, and at the molecular, at the neural, at the behavioral, at the cognitive level. And this is, I think, mind-opening about life in general and about science. It has really strong implications for how we do science, and that we have to be synthetic, not just analytic. We have to be integrative. And if you really want to understand how some new function or structure gets formed, you've got to follow those pathways where they go, and that may take you out of your comfort zone in terms of what you understand and what you know, and you just have to go learn something new. All right, so what I want to do in this talk is I want to talk about one close-up example from behavioral development in humans, and then I'm going to use that to segue into thoughts about the future of how we do science. And the example that I'm going to give comes from, is about motor development. Motor development and how it is a major player in developmental pathways in the first 2 years of life. And it's a major player in just about every developmental pathway, social, emotional, cognitive, language, in the first 2 years. Because in what children can do, their activities change dramatically over the first 2 years as they move from one motor milestone to the next. This orders and gates experience, okay? It determines the order and the nature of what their experiences and coupling to the world can be, and it sets the timetable for development. All right, I'm going to start off by letting you see how much motor development really changes what your experiences are. This is a 4-month-old baby laying on her back. This baby gets to see what her mother shows her, okay? And can't go see stuff. She has to see where she's put, and she gets to see what people put in front of her face, okay? Next view is a very different view. This is a view of a, I believe, 11 or 10-month-old crawler. It's a very different view of the world. Way new opportunities to learn new things about dirt spots, about table legs, about optic flow. A very different kind of sensory information, okay? Here comes my favorite of all time. This is a 13-month-old walker. They don't call them toddlers for nothing. But oh, watch this. This is beautiful. Head stabilization. Reach that ball, pick it up. Very nice. The next one here is also a 13-month-old, only this 13-month-old is not walking. This 13-month-old is sitting and holding an object. Such clarity, such beautiful stability. One object pulled forward, selected, a little social invitation to mom to tell me something, okay? So the example that I'm going to use to illustrate pathways, connections, and some thoughts about integration and integrative approaches to science is this example here of sitting and holding an object and what joint manual and visual exploration of an object can do for you, or does for babies. Now, this wonderful little moment of learning that you saw with that child holding that object up close, clear, stabilized, pulled out from the background, segmented, that didn't come out of nowhere, okay? That ability, being able to do that, depends on a whole complex system of motor developments about which we know a fair bit, and but trunk control, reaching, being able to reach and lean, fine motor skills, eye-hand coordination, and along with trunk control, one of the most critical things of all, head stabilization. You cannot sit there and hold that object and get a beautiful view of it and invite mom to tell you something you didn't know if you have no trunk control and no head stability, because you'll just fall over, literally. Okay. So part of the pathway to being able to create those nice, beautiful visual moments is all this earlier stuff in motor development. All right, there we are. But what I'm going to tell you, the example I want to tell you, is that that beautiful little visual moment that can't happen without the earlier developments in motor, in sitting and holding objects, that beautiful visual moment actually plays a critical role in and is part of the pathway for learning object names. And learning object names is, of course, part of the pathway for much cognitive development, for learning language, semantic knowledge, higher level cognitive functions. And I have little stars there because just like as in motor development, there's a huge complex system that underlies being able to sit and stably hold an object, a whole complicated, interesting pathway to that point. Those big arrows stand for very interesting, multi-causal, complicated pathways, okay? And I'm just going to give you a flavor. And I'm concentrating mostly on these beautiful visual moments to the learning of object names. So, as people mentioned, I collaborate a lot. And actually, I just go around and find really smart people, and then I get well known. In a long-standing, over 25-year history of collaboration with Susan Jones, and now more recently, over the past 5 years, also with Karen James, we have been very interested in how children represent and learn about object shape. And in the current work with Karen and Susan, what we are doing is we are looking in and studying how in those really pristine, lovely moments when babies are holding those objects and looking at them, what the dynamic structure of those object views are, and how the dynamic structure of the views they show themselves as they sit and hold and play with objects, how they create and drive changes in the visual object recognition system, particularly in terms of higher level visual object recognition and the representation of three-dimensional shape. And in our work, we've also shown how these developments are predict and are correlated with object name learning. And they, in a way that's very interesting that I'll raise again a little later, in that children who have language delay, who are struggling in learning language, they don't seem to use the same perceptual properties of objects to form categories, and their particular weakness may lie in these three-dimensional object representations, okay? Which I'll raise that again later. That's an interesting clue to a lot of things, okay? So sitting and stably holding those objects, which of course depends on trunk control and head stabilization, right? And eye-hand coordination, those are creating the dynamic visual experiences that's driving the development of the visual object recognition system, and how well you can recognize objects from different perspectives and in clutter is, of course, a player in how well and how rapidly you learn object names. And then also part of my recent work, with Chen Yu, we have been looking at the sensory dynamics of object play of toddlers and infants with a parent. And we call these the Multisensory Project because in these studies, what we do is we put head cameras on both parents and children, and eye trackers. We got a camera to the world, a camera on the eye, motion sensors on the heads and hands, and of course all the audio recording that's going on. And one of the things that we have found in this work that I think is really interesting and related to those very good moments of a clear object in view is that children are more likely to learn object names. What we do in these studies is we have the mother and child play together, and the mother names objects during the play, and then afterwards we test them for whether they've learned those object names. And what we have discovered is that children are more likely to learn an object name when their head is stabilized, probably also when their heads and eyes are aligned, and all that's more likely when they are holding objects. And that nice clear view you saw, that creates an optimal visual moment that lasts in time for several seconds long, and that sustained attention with a stabilized head, stabilized eyes, and the object in view is supported by holding an object and increases object name learning. So, Holding leads to sitting and holding objects, which of course depends on trunk control and eye-hand coordination and all that motor stuff. Plays a role in stabilizing visual attention and learning object names. Also, as part of this project with Chen, and now we've brought Jack Bates along, I'd just like to collaborate. We've been looking at the dynamic coupling of the sensory motor behaviors of mothers and children in these interactions, and in particular looking at how the eyes and hands of mothers and their children are tightly coordinated. So you know that when you reach for something, your eye goes with your hand goes. But when you're in a social interaction that is nicely dynamically coupled, and the kind of social interaction that leads to learning, if you're a toddler, then where your eyes are not only coupled to your hand very tightly in time, they're also tightly coupled in time to your social partner's hands. Your eyes go where your mother's hands go. And this is the origins of joint action, joint attention, and also plays a really big role in children's learning of object names and setting the social context for learning object names. And Jack Bates has become part of this project because we are seeing very, very interesting individual differences in, now that we have a large enough sample, in how children do this and how children and their parents do this. And those individual differences are related, for those of you who are more in the social developmental area, that we seem to be discovering the microstructure of what's known as parental responsivity. And for those of you in those areas, you know that parental responsivity is a big predictor of developmental outcome. All right, so that's that. All right, so here's the point here. So trunk control and all that motor stuff, right, plays a really big role as part of the pathway of the development of sustained visual attention. It's part of the pathway of developmental changes in visual object recognition, and it's part of the pathway in being able to have coordinated, smooth social interactions where you adjust to what your partner's doing in fractions of a second. And all of those things, well documented by gazillion people, are critical components of the pathway for object name learning. Now, object name learning, of course, is the starting point for language, you know, for us guys in cognitive, the big gorilla, right? But you don't get to language without getting some words. Now, this line of work, where you have to think about the pathway from really trunk control and head stabilization all the way to words, it has, I think, profound kinds of consequences for thinking about developmental process and for making real changes in the lives of children. Chen and I are beginning collaborative work with Jenna Arberson at the University of Pittsburgh with the goal of looking at the baby SIBs of children with autism. Those children have about a 20% likelihood of being diagnosed, but you can start looking at them. If they have an older SIB who's diagnosed with autism, you can start looking at them when they're young, 9 months, 6 months. And often the first indicators are sensory motor oddities or perturbances. And then you can start looking at the perturbation in those pathways with a hope to both understanding what sends the developmental pathway in the direction it does, but also with the hope of going in there and making a difference. And because developmental pathways are so complex, so degenerate in terms of multiple routes and multiple pathways to outcomes, so multi-causal, there's really the chance, if you follow these perturbed pathways and understand them, that you could go in there and find a workaround, find a way to make it happen. And we've also just begun collaborative work with Derek Houston, who's at the medical school, who's a collaborator with David Pizzoni and with David on the with children with cochlear implants. And these are children who have developed sensory motor habits of sharing attention and interacting with their parents when they're unable to hear, that changes and has to reorganize at the point of hearing with the cochlear implant. And that also, I think, is going to lead to really interesting ideas and outcomes. And I don't do this, but Karen James, my colleague, and also Olaf, are very much interested in how the activities that systems do couple, how the activities that organisms do couple neural systems in time, dynamically couple them to the world, their different parts of the brain, bringing functional connections and driving changes in the connections between different neural systems. And activities such as jointly holding and rotating an object and looking at it is a multimodal experience that is bringing together the haptics, the vision, what you do, what you see, okay? And actually Karen's doing amazing work looking at babies and children who have imaging their brain and then looking at different experiences that they're given in terms of these manual activities on objects and the consequences that does to functional connectivity. So these ideas about trunk control mattering and all that motor stuff playing a role in such cognitive processes as attention and learning object names is also very, very interesting to a small and emerging group of roboticists who are known as Developmental or Epigenetic Robotics. And so I have several collaborations with people who actually it's really bidirectional influence, where they're trying to take the findings that we're finding about the role of the motor in the body in organizing attention and stabilizing attention, and using that in baby robots that supposedly are going to learn the way people learn. But also what they're finding comes back and offers new ideas about how these systems may organize in time to solve a task. And at this point, I wanted to mention, people here, when they talk about the psychological and brain sciences at Indiana, they don't usually think about robotics, but I just wanted to mention the first time I met Olaf, how I got to know Olaf at all, was in the 90s. We kept showing up at, he was still at the Neurosciences Institute, he kept showing up at these bizarre, odd conferences that were very small. There was a group of really forward-thinking individuals. I wasn't one of them, I was just invited, but who were trying to give birth to a new field, which was developmental robotics. And they were bringing together neuroscientists, particularly computational neuroscientists and developmental psychologists and roboticists. And so we traveled around at these birthing events for a while. And the emerging organization is known as ICDL, Epigenetic Robotics. And Chen Yu, Olaf, and I hosted one of the meetings here in 2006, and all three of us, Chen, Olaf, and I, are on the governing boards or executive committees of those organizations and have been from their beginning. Well, not Chen, he's too young, but Olaf and I. And so, I mean, this is an emerging field that comes out of sort of taking the pathway approach and taking the integrated view. If you really understand something, right, if you really understand how it works, I ought to be able to build a child. It's a thought. That's the goal. So, you know, sometimes people say to me, but gosh, you work in so many areas. You know, I'm doing motor development, I'm doing semantic networks, I'm doing word learning, I'm looking at head stabilization. But I think that, one, they're all connected, okay? There's a bunch of pathways here. This is not random, incoherent a set of studies. It's really about trying to understand the multiple processes that are in time, that aggregate over time, and that build new structure and function. A lot of interacting processes. Everything you learn today comes out of where you were before. And where you are today makes what comes next. And you just can't divide it all up into pieces and get very far in terms of understanding development. So from my little personal, local, how I do science perspective, it seems to me that the future of science is integrative, cross-discipline. You need to be working with people who know things you don't know so that you can follow the next lead, follow the next step. So that's what it seems like from my little personal perspective, that we have to be integrative, multi-leveled, and that entices you. You know, you get enticed, seduced into playing in robotics, right, even though you don't know much about it. But my local view says that's what's happening in science. It's what's happening in my science. But I think that if you look throughout the fields related to psychological and brain sciences, the arguments and evidence is that it's happening everywhere, that it's as if we've advanced enough that all these fields and all these possibilities are bumping up against each other. So these are just buzzwords that I took from various, proposal calls or directorate calls or whatever for grants from NIH and NSF. And, they're always calling for things about, where you're looking at the interplay between behavioral and computational approaches or computational and neural approaches. They want stuff that goes from molecules to the bedside, right? And molecules to social neuroscience, and a lot of, really, now that we're there, interesting work that can be done at the molecular genetic level, but then all the way up to genomics in people and human genomics, and then looking at behavior and outcomes. A lot of calls for new ones, actually, if the government ever opens, for grants on massive data, and looking at nested dynamic behaviors and processes at nested scales, complex systems. And of course, lots of calls, particularly from NIH, for advances of basic science to clinical science through translation science. So although my own little field is calling for getting out of your comfort zone and working in lots of different fields and understanding the interdependencies among those processes, I think that my little view is probably, this is sort of like a fractal. If you go up, it's going to be the same thing, okay? And you sort of see this everywhere, right? So when I entered psychology a very, very long time ago, there were the 7 traditional areas, and in many places they hardly talk to each other, okay? But now it's all mixed up, and the journals are all mixed up. You have journals like social, cognitive, affective, neuroscience. It's like, can we just put all of psychology in there and give it its own separate name, right? And then, there's all these other kinds of journals that are also linking us to other fields outside of us, okay? To political science or to law or to genomics. And one of the reasons I think that in our own local areas of research, but also the field, the science as a whole, has this kind of expansive interdisciplinary pull to multiple kinds of fields and towards interdisciplinary outside area collaborations, is because psychology ends up being connected to lots and lots of things. So this is a figure that was done by studies of the science of science. And so this figure was made by looking at how, I don't know, some 10,000 journals in different fields, what the citations were across fields. And what was discovered was psychology was one of the hubs, okay? That is, we got lots of people citing us and getting, from neuroscience over to anthropology by going through psychology. We're one of the connectors, one of the hubs, okay? We relate to lots and lots of fields. And this slide here is adapted from a slide that Richard Petty used to talk about the future of psychology. And I believe he first made it to make arguments about funding with some dean. I don't know that dean, former dean is in this room, but about why psychology deserved everything the university had to offer, okay? The heart of it all. I've adapted a little bit, but when you think of us in psychological and brain science, and I think of my fellow colleagues and who they work with and who they collaborate with and what kinds of projects they're working on, you can actually see all of these connections. We have people doing decision theory and neuroeconomics, and people doing looking at the interplay between psychology and law, as well as, of course, all the connections to mathematics, informatics, computer science, and artificial intelligence, which are very strong in this department. And this is where we are. We're like the center. We're the center of the universe, okay? So what does that mean about the future? Well, you know, there's sort of these trite things that you can say, and I think if you go to anybody talking about the future of science, this is what they're going to say. They're going to say that it's going to be more collaborated, it's going to be more connected, there's going to be more working across or at the boundary of disciplines. There's going to be new partitions, new disciplines emerging, like epigenetic robotics, and new fields of study, as you know, the science and the landscape of the kinds of questions we ask get divided up a little differently. But you know, science, like development, like evolution, like culture, is a history-dependent process. It is contingent and opportunistic, and it is complex with lots of multi-causal interconnections, and I think we very rarely are in the midst of anything and have a good idea about where we're going. So we'd like to be ahead of the curve. That's where that guy is there. But in self-organizing systems, it's often kind of lumpy, and although there's a structure emerging, we can't quite see what that lumpy structure is going to turn into. So that brings us with challenge in any kind of complex dynamic system. When you have perturbations or initial shifts to a new equilibrium, there are challenges and instabilities. And so this is actually for some questions for the panel that's going to come after us. Okay, I think we have challenges, and so I'm really hoping that panel, I'm looking over at them here, they're going to offer deep insight and answer my questions. I think there are challenges where the science is changing and the way we do science is changing. So this is a question about what's the balance between core and interdisciplinary research. Are there core disciplines that you have to protect, or can you let people just sort of migrate to the edges, okay? And what do we do about cross-disciplinary training and working across boundaries when we're training our graduate students and our postdocs? Are they going to be grounded in something that's core? Are they going to know how to play? There are all these cultural differences in different disciplines. In the work that I've tried to do, and Olaf can remember these days, and maybe tonight at the reception if we have drinks, we can tell stories because they're pretty funny about the early days of trying to bring neuroscience and developmental psychology, the only girls in the room, and robotics together had many cultural problems with standards of science, standards of challenging people, standards of what counts as good data. So there are all those cultural issues when you're working across disciplines. Then there's the question of big science and big money. Is team science always good? Is it good for innovation? It's good for answering some questions, but it's, you know, what's the value of team science and how much do we want to go that way? And then I think there are also these issues that what we do and how we define disciplines or non-disciplines influences the structure of the academy where we have our daily life, and it influences undergraduate education and how we're going to organize that undergraduate education. And so I'm not going to give you any answers or any thoughts on any of this. This is for the panel that comes after us. And I just wanted, because they're my guys and they do a lot of stuff. There's my lab over time, a few different renditions. All right, thank you.